Hello, everybody, and welcome to the BCLT, to the British Centre for Literary Translation. My name is Duncan, and I'm the Academic Director of BCLT. And I'm joined today by Anindya Sekhar Purakayastha. And I'm delighted to say that Anindya is our Charles Wallace India Trust Translation Fellow for this term. This is a scheme which we've had at the University of East Anglia for 25 years now, and we'll be celebrating the 25th anniversary a bit later in this term. This is the first time that we've been welcoming our visiting Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellow to a virtual residency. And so Anindya, who teaches at Kazi Nazrul University in West Bengal, is joining us from West Bengal. And welcome, Anindya, then. Anindya has been with us already for almost 2 weeks, and that's as part of a 10-week residency altogether. And Anindya is going to be giving a research seminar, a translation workshop, and there will be other events related to his residency as well. So we thought it would be a nice idea, just near the beginning of his residency, to introduce Anindya and his project. So welcome, Anindya. I know your project relates to poetry of the interwar period, the so-called Kallol Era Poets of the 1920s and 30s. And so your project is to translate 100 poems by a variety of authors to produce an anthology, and at the same time also to set these poets in the context of the time. So Anindya, I wonder if I could invite you just to say a little more about your project and to introduce it.
Thank you, Duncan, for the kind introduction. I'm really happy to be a part of the BCLT, and also great to be the Charles Wallace Translation Fellow. It is wonderful the past almost 2 weeks talking to both you and to Anna. It has been wonderful getting different exposures and getting to know more about different activities and events going on in the BCLT. That said, to introduce and to briefly summarize and to say something about my translation project within the Charles Wallace Fellowship. As you said moments back, that it relates to the translation of the interwar poets, Bengali poets. They are known as the Kallol Era Poets. Kallol is a Bengali word that means tidal waves, that connotes the kind of youthful energy and the effusion, sense of effusion and radicality that these Kallol Era poets, they reflected in their work. They were characterized with the sense of literary radicalism, rebellion, a sense of departure from the mainstream trends of poetry writing at that time. Before I go into the details, I think I'd like to characterize and categorize my work in this way, that it comes more within the the larger rubric of if I can say regional world literature, because Bengali poetry is a regional poetry in India, in a pan-Indian spectrum. But Bengal is known for its cultural richness. In fact, people would say that Bengal happens to be the cultural, quote unquote, the cultural capital of India. And Bengal is known for its poetic, poetic richness, prodigious amount of poetic writing over the years. It is largely known because of Rabindranath Tagore, who got the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1913. But Tagore is a big name, and whenever people talk about Indian literature or Bengali literature, they immediately relate it to Rabindranath Tagore. Now, with all due respect to Tagore, and he's a great, as I said, he's a heavyweight, literary heavyweight, a big icon. But having said that, I think one of the problems of this overemphasis on Tagore, and this, as I have mentioned in my proposal, also in my fellowship proposal, that there is a tendency of over hagiography, too much of Tagorean activities within the academia of Bengal. Even the post-colonial Anglophonic scholars would also talk about Tagore, as if that when we talk about Bengali poetry or Indian poetry, it is only Tagore and no one else. So that's the problem. And that prompted me to think of going beyond Tagore, because there were wonderful poets in the post-Tagorean phase. In fact, the Kallol poets were young poets, and there was a small group of avant-garde writers. They were contemporaries of T.S. Eliot, and that's interesting. The parallelism is interesting because, as I said, that this work comes within the larger rubric of decoloniality studies, post-colonial studies, and also world literary studies, or if I can say, regional world literature studies. Um, so they were responding to the literary trends unfolding at that time in Europe. 1922 was the time for the publication of the Westland, and 1922 was also the time for the publication of the seminal work by Nazrul Islam called Bidrahi. If you talk to anyone in Bengal or in Calcutta about Bengali poetry, he or she is bound to mention the text Bidrahi, because that changed the whole spectrum of Bengali poetry writing. It was so radical in its stylistic features, in its use of language, imageries, symbols, and the thematic content also. It was a complete disjunction from the Tagorean trends of writing poetry. So that departure was a welcome trend. People talk about Tagore's association with W.B. Yeats and other writers in England at that time. In fact, Yeats wrote the introduction to the Gitanjali to introduce Tagore to world academia. And it is common knowledge that Yeats had a big role to play in introducing Tagore to the world poetic universe, so that the Nobel Committee could also recognize his poetic work. And Yeats also helped in improving and modifying some part of the translation of Gitanjali as well. Uh, but be that as it may, people talk about all these anecdotes and this association of Tagore with the Western academia. But when we talk about them, we forget to mention about other poets who came after Tagore, who were contemporaries of Tagore. By the way, Tagore also contributed in this Kallol magazine. This is very interesting. Although they went against the Tagorean standards of writing, Tagorean manners of writing poetry, the ideology of writing poetry and the worldviews, their approach to poetry was completely different from Tagore. But to be fair to Tagore, he was quite accommodating to these younger poets, and he decided to contribute to that magazine also. So in a certain sense, Tagore was also a Kallol poet, because he contributed some of his poems in the Kallol magazine. That's quite interesting, the dialogue between the post-Tagorean and the Tagorean worldview of poetry writing. Now, as I said, that it was a time of the traumatized world. I have mentioned in my proposal that it was a time of kind of quote unquote the cannibal times. You have the devastations of the World War, the economic recession, the anti-colonial struggle in India being led by Mahatma Gandhi. It was called the non-cooperation movement. It gave a clarion call to all Indians to participate in that movement. Now, India's participation in the First World War generated some amount of controversy. Gandhi and other leaders of the Congress was in favor of joining, but then it resulted in some amount of backlash among the population. Now, on the one hand, you have this stronger sentiment of anti-colonial struggle, people joining, specifically the younger generation, joining Gandhi's call for fighting against the British. On the other hand, you have the literary world, and these young writers are responding poetically to that moment of what should I say, that sense of angst, that sense of anguish and frustration emerging out or unfolding out of that historical juncture. Now, the question is, how did they respond to that historic moment, which was emerging and unfolding after the First World War? Mm, the erstwhile and the mainstream tendency in Bengali poetry was to look for that spirit, that sense of spiritual equipoise, that sense of serenity, going for tradition, and that sense of aesthetic peace and aesthetic security. But these younger poets, who, as I said, that the genesis of the Kallol Era Poets could be traced to an association, a literary association. It was, to be more precise, a club, a literary club. It was called the Four Arts Club. And two gentlemen, Gokul Nag and there was another person, they were instrumental in forming that club, where people in Bengal who were connoisseurs of painting, poetry, fiction, drama, and other examples of fine art, they would flock to that club, and they would discuss and debate about the emerging trends in the world of aesthetics and culture. So that club was established in the year 1921. So you can well imagine that it was a time when in Europe the high tide of European literary modernism was unfolding, and these people back in Calcutta, they were quite aware about what was happening in Paris and in London, what kind of writings are being carried out there. So they wanted to replicate that in their own ways in Calcutta. And well into the 1922s and 1923, they realized that just doing club activities is not adequate. So they should come out with something concrete. So it was proposed that they should come with a magazine. By the way, there were quite rich traditions of literary magazines in Bengal at that time. Tagore used to write in very flagship magazines like Bharati, Sobuj Potro. They were very well-known literary magazines. So there was a tradition of literary magazines in Bengal. So these young people, they felt that we should do something new, and let us come out with a magazine which would be named in a different way, and it would be a platform for younger poets who do not have a rich legacy of writing. They are not well known. And another important feature of those young group of poets who were associated with the Kallol magazine were that they were all coming from the rural areas of Bengal. So the hegemony of Calcutta, of the urban elitosphere of elite Bengali culture, or what is known locally as Bhadralok culture in Bengal. Bhadralok is elite, right? So that elite urban Bengali culture was challenged by these rural youths who came to Calcutta in search of profession, jobs, and other activities for livelihoods, because it was a time of economic recession. We didn't have jobs in the rural areas. The agrarian economy was also suffering because of the beginning of industrialization in India at that time. So these young people, they flocked to that gathering in Kallol, and there was not, you don't come across any manifesto or a kind of announced programmatic way of beginning that this is what we are and we're going to write these and these, blah, blah, blah. No, not that kind of stuff. They began impromptu, that they felt that there is a necessity to do something new, and they captured that moment and responded to it historically, aesthetically. And this is how the first issue of the Kallol magazine was published in the year 1923. So 1921 was the establishment of the club, and 1923 is the beginning of the publication of the first issue of the Kallol magazine. And that created were a lot of sensation, because for the first time the Bengali readership could see that here is a magazine which is publishing something which is not familiar. They're not familiar with this kind of stuff which they saw in other literary platforms. So that immediately drew a lot of attention, and prominent poets also started contributing in the Kallol magazine for next issues. And from the next issues, they could understand that now the time has arrived for them to clearly uh, announce the manifesto, the objective that they have, in which way they are different from the other group of poets and other group of magazines. So they started slowly and gradually articulating their specific ideas about poetry, which was characterized by, as I said, capturing the quotidian and the everyday life of Bengal, um, talking about the subaltern classes, which you didn't find in the earlier literary expressions. Not only the subaltern classes, but then the sub-subaltern, the lumpen proletariat even, right? So the complexities of their life, the urban squalor, and you also had references to Freudian psychology in the writings. In fact, they were accused of overdoing sexuality, the libidinal aspect of life. So that was also quite interesting, because in that way they are coming closer to their European, counterparts, right, of the high tides of European modernism. And this sense of iconoclastic tendency to demolish anything which was over traditional and preventing the way forward. So that sense of rebellion, that youthful energy and sense of fusion to do something new, responding to the European literary trends, relating to the surroundings of urban life, and also recognizing the needs for talking about the body, not just Tagore would be focusing too much on the spiritual aspects of life, but they decided to go for also for the bodily, the psychosexual, and they also touched upon various economic and political issues of that time also. So another very important point about the Kallol group of poets were the fact that they also addressed the gender issue. So some women poets who also joined the group and started writing. In fact, I was reading closely and found that there was one woman writer who started writing about female homosexuality at that time, way back in the 1930s. It is amazing. At that time, it was unthinkable for women to be so daring and thinking of writing that. And as it grew, I think suffice it to say that many new writers would come and join them. It provided them that platform which is necessary for younger writers to articulate uh, uh, their 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 ways of thinking and responding to that moment of history, and that is how it happened. The To conclude, the the amazing thing about the Kallol magazine is that it lasted just for 7 years, from 1923 to 1929, almost 7 years. But within that span of just 7 years, just not even a full decade, they could do remarkably well to facilitate a shift and a transformation in Bengali poetry. And that had its impact on modern Indian poetry writing also. Because the kind of stuff that they introduced in their writing and the stylistic features that they introduced impacted not only Bengali poetry, they forced the senior poets to readjust the times, to think anew about how to write. Even Tagore also recognized their talents and said, in fact, there was a debate among the oldies and the new writers. It was a famous debate. And there was a magazine called Shonibarer Chithi, Letters of Saturday. That magazine was primarily satirizing the newer writers. And they pleaded to Tagore, because Tagore was a big figure, and whatever he would say would be accepted by all. So they pleaded to Tagore that, don't you think that what these younger guys are writing is nothing but anarchy? But Tagore didn't agree. He said that these are new poets and we need to welcome them. And if we are thinking about the progression of Bengali poetry, and if we think of moving ahead, we need to welcome them. So that's a fascinating chapter of Bengali poetry. But after the end and after the closure of the magazine, and the magazine was closed not because of any other reason, but purely because of economic reason, because the two people who were primarily instrumental for publishing this, they went bankrupt and couldn't gather more money to run and to continue with this magazine. But with the close of the magazine, the momentum didn't die. It continued, and then it impacted the poetry of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So the political, the social, and the cultural radicalism that you find in the poetry of the 40s and the 50s should be attributed to these Kallol Era poets, because they initiated that in Bengali poetry. So this is, in a nutshell, how I can summarize the Kallol Era poets. And I think post-colonial scholars who are doing post-colonial studies in India should recognize these wonderful poetic voices, because enough has been talked about Indian English writing. I do salute these writers. They are great writers. But then it is high time, I feel personally, that as a post-colonial scholar, that we need to provide more attention to these neglected terrain of regional writing, the Bhasha writing as they are called, because they're wonderful poets who need global recognition and global attention. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating to hear about this wonderfully rich project that you're working on. And we look forward very much to hearing more and to hearing some of the fruits of your labor. I know you will be reading from some of your translations later in your residency. We look forward very much to that. And thank you so much for introducing us today to your project and to this fascinating world of the Kallol Era Poets. Anindya, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for providing me the facility to talk about the Kallol Era Poets. Thank you.